Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader and welcome to the final reading wrap-up of 2024, where I cover the books I've read from late October until late December. So since the last reading wrap-up, I've finished 6 books and I've read a surprising amount of fiction this end of year. So I've read 2 non-fiction books and 4 fiction books. And as it has been in recent months, it has been mainly history books about Asia or novels by Asian authors, including the South Korean Nobel Prize winner in literature Han Kang. The first book I read is Golden Age by Wang Xiaobo, written in 1991. This is actually a Chinese novel. It was originally published in Taiwan and later in mainland China. And it starts out during the Cultural Revolution. And it's basically about this character called Wang Er and his sexual escapades as a young guy and him just going through life in communist China with an overbearing government. So part of the novel takes place during the very violent communist era in the 60s and 70s, and then later it takes place in the 80s when the communist state was less repressive and less communist. But it's basically Wang Er going through life, being introspective and spending a bunch of time with different girls. And it's a bit of a weird novel. The sex scenes are described in a quite strange way, but yeah, I liked it in a strange way, this novel. If you want to understand how it was to live as an intellectual in China, both during the communist era and during the reform era, then I would definitely recommend you to check out The Golden Age. Next book I read is Three Tigers, One Mountain, A Journey Through the Bitter History and Current Conflicts of China, Korea, and Japan by Michael Booth. So this is basically a travel writer who travels throughout Japan, South Korea, mainland China, and Taiwan. He doesn't go to North Korea. And here he breaks down the bitter history wars where there's disagreement on historical facts between China, Korea, and Japan, along with the current conflicts, since there are disputed territories still. It's an interesting book. Each chapter is about a specific city, although there are some cities like Seoul who have several chapters dedicated to them. This book has some interesting reflections on current events. So for example, China, while it is an oppressive state, according to Booth and the Chinese youngster he has talked to, young people in China are able to often bypass the Great Firewall that censors the internet by using VPNs, which contradicts something I've read in a previous book by Tim Marshall called The Age of Walls, which basically said that the Chinese state Great Firewall was highly effective. But according to this book, it's not. Another interesting fact in this book, most Japanese people do not deny the war crimes of Japan. And a lot of Japanese people are very open to reconciling with South Korea and China. So it's just a very small far-right minority that drives around in these black vans shouting slogans of how the comfort women were voluntary or nothing happened in Nanking, yada yada yada. But China and South Korea often apparently have tried to really play up these historical tragedies to gain the moral high ground from Japan. And Japanese people, even though they're open to reconciling, it seems to some of them increasingly that since South Korea and China are not ready to move on from this, what's the point of continuing to discuss this? So yeah, if you want to understand why Japanese and Chinese and Koreans dislike each other, then you should definitely check out this book. By the way, when I say that a lot of Chinese dislike the Japanese, I'm not including the Taiwanese. The Taiwanese actually like Japan quite a lot because when Taiwan was a Japanese colony, they were treated as a model colony, so they were governed in a far more benevolent way than was Korea. Next book I read was The Struggle for Taiwan, A History by Sulman Wasif Khan. This book actually came out this year in 2024. And it's basically lays out the history behind the Taiwan question. You know that Taiwan is de facto an independent country, but almost no UN member recognizes it, and it's still formally called the Republic of China. And mainland China, or the People's Republic of China, professes that Taiwan is a rogue province and that it needs to be returned to China. And the status of Taiwan was actually determined at the 1948 Cairo Conference with Roosevelt, Chiang Kai-shek, and Churchill. And at the time, the Republic of China was loosely controlled by Chiang Kai-shek. Taiwan was returned to Chiang Kai-shek in 1945, but Chiang Kai-shek lost the Chinese Civil War to Mao Zedong in 1949, so he escaped to Taiwan with his Republic of China retinue of army. And Khan believes that this situation of how Taiwan is treated by the United States and China has been extremely mismanaged in the past 75 years, and that the conflict over the Taiwan Strait multiple times has almost escalated into war, especially in the, I think, 1950s and 1990s, which I think he exaggerates the danger of war in this book, at least at those times, because he basically said that it's luck that prevented war, which no, usually when war is avoided, it's because of free will and diplomacy or deterrence. Khan basically argues that Taiwan in the 1940s or 50s should have been made a UN or US trusteeship on the road to independence. And he argues that prior to 1945, Taiwan was actually never part of China because Taiwan was annexed by Japan in 1895, and prior to that it was part of the Qing Empire, which annexed it in the 17th century. Khan basically argues that the Qing Empire was not a Chinese empire, that it governed disparate groups, so China, Taiwan, Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet. I don't know, that idea that the Qing Empire wasn't Chinese is a little dubious. But his analysis on the history of Taiwan since it democratized in the 1990s is really fascinating. And it also shows that the DPP party, the so-called Taiwanese nationalists in Taiwan, aren't that radical in recent years. They've been relatively pragmatic. He talks about also the democratization under Lee Teng-hui in the 1990s, and that guy was actually born in Taiwan, and he served as president, and he went against the grain in his party, the Nationalist or the KMT, to democratize Taiwan. But Khan is hypercritical of Chiang Kai-shek, basically saying that the United States should not have backed Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese Civil War, that he was corrupt, that he cared more about killing communists than winning the Sino-Japanese War. And at times he portrays Mao a bit too much in a positive light for me, this author. I mean, he says basically that Tibet had autonomy in the 1950s, which I strongly doubt, because Tibet was conquered by China by force. And he underappreciates how Chiang Kai-shek began the modernization of Taiwan in the 1960s. He doesn't acknowledge either that one of the reasons that the nationalists lost the Chinese Civil War is because during the Sino-Japanese War in World War II, the people who mainly got killed by the Japanese were the nationalists. The communists kind of tried to stay behind and not fight that much the Japanese to save their forces for the Chinese Civil War. So yeah, those are nuances that Khan doesn't discuss. But it's still a very interesting, thought-provoking book about the Taiwan Strait, so I would definitely recommend it. Just read it with a huge grain of salt. The next book I read is House of Cards by Michael Dobbs, written in 1989. And yes, this is the House of Cards book that the TV show House of Cards is based on, but House of Cards, the book, takes place in British politics instead of American politics, with Francis Urquhart instead of Francis Underwood. By the way, I've actually seen every season of House of Cards, the American version, not the British version. So here, Francis Urquhart is the chief whip of the Conservative cabinet. And the author, by the way, Michael Dobbs, was at one point Margaret Thatcher's chief of staff. Now, there are interesting elements in this political thriller that are interesting in the machinations of British politics, but for some reason when I read this book it was a little dull. It's not that long of a book, it's what, 350, 400 pages, but I had to drag out reading this book over a period of like 3 or 4 weeks. It's okay, but No, I would not recommend this book at all. Maybe I'm not in the right mood to read this political fiction, but I did not enjoy reading this book. Now, a book I really enjoyed reading, which has a complicated title, Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage, written by Haruki Murakami in 2013. So for me, this book is a spiritual and improved upon sequel of Murakami's book Norwegian Wood, because it has similar themes. So this novel is about, well, Tsukuru Tazaki. So he used to be part of a friend group when he was a teenager of 5 people. Each of the characters, except him in that friend group, is named after a color in Japanese. So ergo why he's colorless. And these are all mostly high achievers in this friend group. So his hometown, I think it's Nagoya, but he's the only one, Tazaki, to go to university in Tokyo. But about a year or two after he moves to the university in Tokyo, his friend group basically announces to him that they no longer want to ever talk to him again. After this, Tazaki becomes depressed and doesn't really care if he dies in the next year or so. Eventually, he kind of pulls himself out of this, but he still has a lot of emotional trauma from this in the next 15 years of his life. And he does date some girls, but he doesn't have any long-term relationship because he doesn't want to get close to anyone. But eventually he meets a very nice lady who's older than him. So this is when they're both in their, I think, late 30s. And she basically says, go talk to your friends now. It's been 15 years. Learn why they abandoned you. So he goes through this journey of visiting all of these friends. One is a car salesman, another one is some guru, another one has moved to Finland and married a Finnish guy. So part of this novel takes place in Finland from a Japanese perspective, which I am Finnish myself, have Finnish. So it was interesting to read about how a Japanese person visiting Finland sees it. But now I'm gonna move on to the spoilers. So one of the characters is actually murdered and we never find out who the murderer is. And this character, the reason that Tsukuru was kicked out of his friend group was because she accused him of rape. And all of the other characters basically suspected that she was lying, but she described it in such detail and the other girl backed her up. So yeah, they basically agreed to exclude him from the friend group because she had a very unstable mental health, but she gradually deteriorated over time, lost her vitality, and just dies. So there are very sad and painful moments throughout this novel. And the girl who moved to Finland apparently had a crush on Tsukuru. And then another of the characters, it's strongly implied that he's gay apparently. And as in Norwegian Wood, the ending of this novel is open-ended. Will he end up in a relationship with this nice older girl? I'm an optimist, so I'm gonna assume yes. Because I basically interpret this book as pulling yourself out of the mental abyss. I would strongly recommend this novel, although since this is Murakami, this is a bit of a heavy read in the sense that it weighs you down at times mentally. It's also beautiful in this novel when you think about it, because, for example, the main character Tsukuru, he really loves building train stations for some reason. So he just goes around, sometimes sits down and observes people coming and going from trains. And he has a passion for this. So it's lovely to read about how he has managed to move through life through embracing his passion. I've read now 3 Haruki Murakami books, and this is my favorite so far. Colorless, Tsukuru, Tazaki, and His Years of Pilgrimage. I think the pacing in this book is way better than the pacing in Norwegian Wood. Although the themes are similar and both are well written, so I think both books are worth reading. Which one you read first, it's up to you. This is a more mature novel, of course, since Murakami wrote this almost 30 years after he wrote Norwegian Wood. And the final book I read is The Vegetarian by Han Kang, written in 2007. So Han Kang actually won the Nobel Prize in Literature this year. And the Nobel Prize in Literature is distributed in Sweden, by the way. So I could watch some of that footage in original Swedish, so that was fun. And when you listen to her talk, she's just a very sweet woman. But this is a very strange novel, and I recently attended a book club event in my honors program at my university about this novel. I have mixed feelings about this novel. It's in 3 parts, and there will be spoilers while I'm talking about this. So the first part is from the perspective of the husband, the second part is from the perspective of the brother-in-law, and the third part is from the perspective of the sister. And this story is about a woman, a plain woman. The husband married her because she's plain looking, so she won't be demanding, she doesn't have that much enthusiasm in life. But she decides to turn vegan one day. Not vegetarian, vegan. She stops eating meat, she throws out all the meat in the fridge. She has a mental breakdown basically and tries to cut herself when her father tries to force feed her meat. Literally tries to push meat into her mouth. So yeah, she spends some time at the hospital, then she's released. Then you have the brother-in-law, who I have to say is an ungrateful loser. So he's married to the sister of this main character. And the sister is a go-getter woman who works hard. The husband doesn't really have a serious job, he's just an artist. He's allowed to work however he wants with his schedule. The sister just expects him to pick up their child from school, but he cannot even manage to do that. And he does some word art, so he decides that he wants to paint flowers on the main character, naked. And yeah, there are some scenes in this novel that are just strange. Like he's painting her naked, and he's filming her, and he's painting another guy who's with her naked and filming them. Then he paints himself with flowers so he can have access to her sexually. But then the sister-in-law one morning shows up and basically calls a mental hospital, which throws the main character in a mental hospital because, yeah, she's gone insane. And brother-in-law spends some time in jail, is released, and then just leaves. He's a deadbeat dad basically. And the final part, of course, is about the sister, and she now can see how the main character has just deteriorated. Like, she's really emaciated. She only drinks water because she actually wants to become a tree. I'm not kidding. And yeah, you have the mental hospital staff who are trying to force feed her. And when I read books, I try to reach either the most logical or optimistic conclusion I can. And here the logical conclusion of the end of this novel, even though it's not stated, is that the main character dies. She dies from anorexia and starvation. She basically committed a slow suicide. So yeah, The Vegetarian. It's a short book, less than 200 pages. This is translated in English. I'm learning Korean right now, so maybe in a couple of years I can read one of Han Kang's books in original Korean. I don't really know what to make of this book. Would I really recommend it? If you're a very literary person, sure, but I would not recommend this book for the average reader. It's such a strange novel. This book might be the weirdest novel I've read. This is a really, really strange novel, so keep that in mind. So those were the books I read in the end of 2024. When this video is released, it will be between Christmas and New Year's. So I wish everyone a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. There will be more booktube content to come in 2025, about a video a month or so. But otherwise, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.